You knew. Before you ever said anything. Before the conversation. Before the disappointment. Before the self-doubt. You knew in your body. In the tightening in your chest. When you thought about bringing it up. In the shallow breath you took before asking for something simple. In the way your shoulders tensed. As if you were preparing for impact. That wasn't insecurity. That was information. You weren't afraid of asking. You were afraid of what would happen after you did. Because somewhere along the way, your nervous system learned that your needs came with consequences. That wanting more meant tension. That honesty meant distance. That clarity meant withdrawal. So you adapted. Quietly. You started explaining instead of stating. Softening instead of standing. Justifying instead of trusting. You added context. You added disclaimers. You added empathy for their position before honoring your own. You didn't do this because you were weak. You did it because you were perceptive. You noticed how their energy changed. When you spoke directly, you noticed the pause, the sigh, the defensiveness, the subtle shift away, and your body logged it. So the next time, you didn't just ask. You prepared. You rehearsed. You minimized. You made it smaller than it was, so it would be easier for them to accept. And when you finally decided not to bring it up at all, your body felt relief. Not peace. Relief. That's the part most people misunderstand. You didn't feel better because you didn't need anything. You felt better because you avoided another moment of emotional risk. Another moment where you might feel unseen, unmet, or too much. This is how self-abandonment becomes invisible, not through dramatic sacrifice, but through quiet adjustments that feel like maturity. You told yourself you were being understanding. You told yourself it wasn't worth the tension. You told yourself you could handle it. But your body told a different story. Your body held the fatigue, the resentment, the dull ache of being emotionally alone. Inside connection. That's the cost of explaining your needs to someone who isn't truly available to meet them. Over time, your system stopped seeing honesty as safe, not because honesty was dangerous, but because it wasn't received. So you shifted. You stopped expecting responsiveness. You stopped asking clearly. You stopped trusting that your needs would land without backlash. And instead of recognizing this as a relational mismatch, you internalized it. You wondered if you were asking too much. You wondered if you were being dramatic. You wondered if this was just how relationships worked. But here's the truth. Your nervous system has always known. Healthy connection doesn't require constant translation. You don't need the perfect wording. For someone who is emotionally present, you don't need to pre-soothe. Someone who is capable of holding discomfort, you don't need to explain your humanity. To someone who respects it, the shift begins the moment you stop overriding what your body is telling you. When you stop mistaking relief for alignment. When you stop calling silence self-control. When you stop shrinking to preserve connection. Because the goal was never to become easier to be with. The goal was to be real, without bracing. And the moment you stop explaining your needs isn't the moment you give up. It's the moment you realize they were never unclear. They were simply unsupported. And your body knew that. Long before your mind caught up, you didn't stop explaining because you stopped caring. You stopped because your body learned. It wasn't being met. Not dramatically, not all at once. Quietly, in the way your shoulders tensed. Before you spoke, in how you softened your voice. Before sharing something real, in how you rehearsed, so you wouldn't sound demanding. In how you added context to emotions that didn't need defending. You weren't asking for too much. You were asking in an environment that required justification for basic care. And your nervous system noticed. Every time you explained a need, That should have been obvious. Your body registered a small loss of safety. Not enough to leave. Enough to adapt. So you became clearer, kinder, more reasonable. You anticipated reactions. Before they happened, you edited yourself. Before you were interrupted, you adjusted your needs to fit what felt acceptable. This wasn't weakness. It was intelligence. Your system was trying to preserve connection without triggering conflict. Because somewhere along the way, you learned that needing less kept the peace. That clarity could feel confrontational. That asking directly might cost you closeness. So instead of saying, I need reassurance, you said, it's fine. Instead of saying, that hurt, you said, maybe I'm sensitive. Instead of saying, I need consistency, you waited and hoped they would notice. This is how self-abandonment begins. Not as a choice, as a strategy. Your body wasn't confused. It was responding to a pattern where needs were tolerated, but not welcomed, where emotions were heard, but not held, where explaining became necessary, because attunement was missing. And when attunement is missing, clarity feels unsafe, because clarity requires someone on the other side who can stay present without defensiveness, who can hear a need without making it about themselves, who can respond instead of react. So your system adjusted again. It learned to speak less, to wait more, to feel quietly, because explaining didn't bring relief. It brought negotiation, delay, sometimes dismissal, and over time, your body associated expression with exhaustion, not because you were wrong, but because you were alone in the emotional work. This is the part most women miss. You didn't stop explaining because you healed. You stopped because your body refused to keep overfunctioning. It got tired of translating, tired of softening truth, tired of carrying both the feeling and the response. That fatigue isn't apathy. It's self-protection. Your nervous system learned that silence felt safer than repeated disappointment. That containment felt calmer than constant clarification. So you became quieter, more internal, more observant. You started noticing how much effort it took to be understood, how little effort it took for them to misunderstand. And something shifted, not emotionally, physiologically. Your body stopped offering explanations where there was no capacity to receive them. This is not emotional shutdown. This is discernment forming at the level of the nervous system. You began to feel the difference between someone who wants clarity and someone who wants comfort without change, between questions that seek understanding and questions that delay accountability, between curiosity and avoidance. And once your body learns that difference, it stops volunteering energy where it won't be met. That's when explaining starts to feel heavy, not dramatic, just unnecessary, because clarity doesn't require constant articulation. When safety is present, and where safety isn't present, no amount of explanation creates it. So your system chose stillness, not as punishment, as information. And that's where the real shift begins. What you were responding to wasn't rejection, it was absence. Not the obvious kind, the quiet kind, the kind where someone is physically present, but emotionally unavailable. The kind where your needs don't get argued with, they just don't get met. So your system adapted, not consciously, instinctively. You learned that asking created tension, that wanting created distance, that expressing yourself changed the atmosphere. And because connection mattered to you, you began protecting it by becoming smaller, by becoming easier, by becoming more reasonable than you actually felt. This is how self-silencing begins. Not because you didn't know what you needed, but because you knew what it cost to say it. You felt the shift in your body first, the tightening, the holding, the slight drop in energy when you realized you'd be carrying this one alone. Your nervous system learned that safety didn't come from expression. It came from anticipation, from managing reactions, from reading moods, from staying one step ahead emotionally. That's not weakness. That's intelligence, forced into survival. You weren't confused. You were perceptive. You noticed that when you explained yourself clearly, nothing really changed. You noticed that reassurance didn't follow honesty. That closeness didn't deepen after vulnerability. So you stopped risking it. Not all at once, but slowly. A thought left unspoken here, a need minimized there, until your inner world became something you carried privately. And that loneliness you felt wasn't because you were alone. It was because you were unseen while being with someone. This is the psychological cost of being with someone who benefits from your silence. You start to doubt your own timing, your tone, your expectations. You ask yourself if you're asking for too much, when you're really asking for consistency. You tell yourself, they just don't understand, when the truth is, they understand enough to not change. And because you're emotionally capable, you take on the responsibility. You translate, you soften, you adjust, until the relationship feels calm on the surface and heavy inside you. That heaviness isn't drama, it's grief. Grief for the version of you who didn't need to rehearse before speaking. Grief for the safety you thought connection would bring. Grief for how much awareness you developed just to stay. You didn't imagine the imbalance. Your body kept the score. Every time you swallowed something true, every time you told yourself it wasn't worth the tension, every time you chose peace over authenticity. And here's the part that matters. You didn't stay because you were weak. You stayed because you were loyal, because you were hopeful, because you believed connection could grow if you tried harder. But connection doesn't grow where expression isn't safe, and self-trust erodes every time you override your knowing. That's why the shift feels so subtle. When it begins, you don't suddenly become louder. You don't confront dramatically. You just stop explaining, not as punishment, as protection, because your system is tired of giving clarity where there is no capacity. And deep down, you already know if someone needed you to explain your needs repeatedly, they weren't missing information, they were missing willingness. And your body has always known the difference. And deep down, you already know if someone needed you to explain your needs repeatedly, they weren't missing information, they were missing willingness. And your body has always known the difference. You don't need to justify wanting. You don't need to soften your requests. You don't need to over-explain to be seen. The people who care will meet you where you are. They will respond without you carrying the weight. The ones who can't will reveal themselves through absence, through indifference, through the quiet drift of disengagement. That drift is not loss. It is clarity. It is liberation. You stop shrinking. You stop editing yourself. You stop negotiating your presence. You notice the subtle ways. Your body relaxes. Your chest softens. Your mind stops racing. Your energy stops leaking into managing others' feelings. You observe without needing to fix. You listen without needing to explain. You offer space without offering labor. And that space becomes magnetic. It draws those capable of true connection. It repels those who were never ready to meet you fully. You begin to trust yourself, not just your mind, your body, your instincts, your energy. You stop confusing effort with love. You stop confusing availability with worth. You stop confusing compromise with intimacy. You let relationships unfold through behavior, not through your editing, not through your labor. You recognize patterns. You name them quietly to yourself. You allow them to guide your choices. Without judgment, without resentment, you notice what feels light, what feels responsive, what feels mutual, and you gravitate toward that. You notice what feels heavy, what feels draining, what feels one-sided, and you step back. This is not coldness. This is discernment. This is self-trust. This is emotional empowerment. Your needs are valid. Your presence is enough. Your energy is protected. You stop apologizing for being who you are. You stop compensating for others' unwillingness. You stop shrinking to maintain connection. And finally, you rest in your own regulation. You feel calm. You feel steady. You feel safe. This is the shift. The shift that comes when you stop explaining, when you stop overgiving, when you stop negotiating your worth,